I'm Hannes from Sabaton.
And I'm Freddie Mercury.
And this is Sabaton History. Screaming eagles. You know, eagles don't actually scream. It's more like a ah.
And our song, Screaming Eagles, is about the 101st Airborne at the Battle of the Bulge.
I am aware that people call them the 101st, but in terms of flow for an oral narrative, I'm going to call them the 101st, just so I can tell the story more smoothly. Spirits were high among the common German soldiers as they passed lines of tanks, shells, and ammunition on their way to the front lines in France and Belgium in the early December days of 1944. It had been a disastrous year for the Wehrmacht, suffering defeat after defeat on all fronts. But suddenly, there was this big army assembling in the west, ready to go on the offensive once again, with no lesser aim but to tear apart the Allied coalition in the west in one decisive thrust. It felt like 1940 all over again. However, this was not the German army that had been sent on the offensive in Poland, France, or Russia 4 or 5 years before. By the early winter of 1944, Germany's military consisted partly of battle-hardened veterans and partly of young boys and old men that had been pressed into the now struggling war machine. The Reich was scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of conscription and logistics. Supply had always been a weakness of the German army, but in 1944, it clearly, seriously lacked adequate motorization, fuel, and ammunition to support an endeavor like this new Western one. The armored wedge of the offensive was an amalgamation of different models, as was the artillery. Some Panthers and Jagdpanzer, but mostly Panzer IVs and modified half-tracks. But the Panzer Grenadiers rode on the tanks. The paratroopers were reinforced by young men from the Luftwaffe personnel, and the Volksgrenadiers were made of shattered divisions. So despite the impressive numbers, the army seemed to lack the capability of fulfilling Adolf Hitler's vision for destroying his enemies. As the attack finally began on December 16th, it did fail to achieve its objectives rather quickly. The 6th Panzer Army, which was supposed to lead the main attack, had been held up by stubborn American resistance at Saint-Vit, Malmedy, and Elsenborn Ridge. Even though the main thrust had failed, though, the supporting 5th Panzer Army had managed to achieve considerable success further south, as it had found a weak spot in the American lines in the Ardennes. Plans shifted on the spot. 5th Army would advance all the way to the River Meuse, taking the town of Bastogne in the process. Bastogne was not only a major traffic hub, but also a depot for Allied fuel, storing nearly 3 million gallons. A precious resource to the Germans if captured, sure, but even if destroyed, it would sabotage plans for an American offensive in the coming spring. If Bastogne were taken quickly, there might still be a chance to further advance beyond the Meuse and towards Namur. Before the offensive, the area around Bastogne was considered a pretty quiet sector of the front by American high command. It lay in between the operational sector of the 1st Army, which had been slogging through the Hütgen forest, and the 3rd Army south of Luxembourg, which was grinding against the German fortifications of the Siegfried Line. So the Ardennes had been seen as a resting zone for battered divisions, or a training ground for green units who needed to gain some experience from the small skirmishes that did take place there. To attack Bastogne, though, the Germans would have to send a large armored force through the thickly wooded Ardennes, with only a few roads available. Such a maneuver was considered extremely unlikely by the Allies, especially in the winter. I mean, a surprise attack through the Ardennes? Who could have predicted that? Sure, that was exactly what the Germans did in 1940, but not again, right? So, the Ardennes sector was only thinly held by 3 American divisions when the armored spearhead of the Germans appeared on the scene. Overrunning American lines, elements of the 5th Panzer Army then rushed in to exploit the break in those lines. They knew they had only a small window of time of maybe 4 or 5 days until the Allies would send in reinforcements. The Americans in the Ardennes had no hope of halting the German advance, but could at least try to blunt the spearhead, and deprived the Germans of precious time. So in a fighting retreat, they delayed the Germans with anti-tank guns and bazookas, causing traffic jams by taking out the lead tanks on the narrow forest roads. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, in overall command of the sector, had been promised big reinforcements, but they would take time. The only immediately available forces in the vicinity were the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions, currently being refitted at Rem after their costly attacks during Operation Market Garden. While the 82nd was sent north towards Saint-Vite, the 101st, Screaming Eagles, were rushed towards Bastogne. The 101st was an experienced and battle-proven unit, but it did not have adequate winter equipment and not really enough heavy weapons available either. Anyhow, after 2 days of fighting the German advance in the Ardennes, the American retreat had become total, and the troops flooded back towards Bastogne, away from the German panzers. The roads to Bastogne were open, but the weather worsened. This was bad for the Americans, as rain and fog grounded the American Air Force. But at Bastogne, the men prepared their defenses. Field artillery and M7 self-propelled howitzers dug in on a semicircular perimeter, while engineers turned the town into a fortress. The 19th, panzers appeared on the outskirts of town, and those American tanks that were available rode out to meet them, delaying the German advance once again. That night, the Screaming Eagles finally arrived in Bastogne. So too did the elite German Panzerlehr Division. The next day, the Screaming Eagles were smack in the center of the action. While the German tanks and tank destroyers attacked and destroyed the retreating or bogged down American army units just outside Bastogne, the 101st engaged the German infantry. Supported by field artillery, the Screaming Eagles fought through the outskirts and local villages and even barricaded themselves inside an old chateau, shooting down the Panzer Grenadiers who tried to flush them out. This stiff resistance cost the Germans even more time, and it was not until the 22nd that Bastogne was finally surrounded. Hitler gave the order, Bastogne must be taken at all cost. On that day, 2 blindfolded officers of the Panzerlehr approached the headquarters of General McAuliffe, in overall command of the various troops trapped inside the city. The 2 officers asked the Americans to surrender. Confronted by the offer, McAuliffe blurted out laughing, "Nuts!" Bastogne was encircled, true, but for days now the Germans had tried unsuccessfully to break in and had been repelled time and again. And let's face it, being encircled was basically part of the job description of the 101st Airborne. Lost for adequate words, McAuliffe also just typed out "nuts" on the document. To the puzzled Germans who asked, what was this supposed to mean? The Americans simply explained that they should go to hell and that every German trying to get into the town was about to be killed. So the German forces built up again, reinforced by more veteran Panzer Grenadiers from Italy and more tanks and tank destroyers. But the skies cleared, and the American Air Force was able to resupply the encircled city. The 101st had dug in on Christmas Day in the woods northeast of the city. Digging into the frozen ground in the woods was difficult, but every foxhole was a lifesaver as the German shells dropped all around them. In the freezing cold, the German grenadiers infiltrating the woods in white camouflage were met with rifle and machine gun fire, and the advancing panzers were engaged with bazookas and howitzers. Wave after wave, the Germans advanced on the 101st from different directions, but time and time again, the paratroopers and glider infantry fought them off in a series of vicious battles through woods and villages. Specialized tree buster shells were soon falling on the German positions, savaging the attackers with splinters and shrapnel. The Christmas attack was an absolute disaster for the Germans, with heavy casualties and the loss of a lot of tanks. The siege continued, but the major threat had been fought off. By the 26th, the reserves from Patton's Third Army had finally established a corridor into Bastogne, though it would take several more days to secure it since the Germans were trying to cut it off. Skirmishes continued, but even newly arrived SS divisions could not establish another siege. By January, fearing that they might lose overall control of the front, German high command ordered a full retreat, and the overall strategic initiative in the West shifted to the Americans. By now, the U.S. Air Force was flying attacks again, and on January 12th, when the news of a Soviet winter offensive broke, so too did Hitler's last gamble in the West. "101st Airborne. What about them?"
Well, 101st Airborne, we visited them at Fort Campbell. And I just want to say to anyone who was there and to anyone in the 101st and at Fort Campbell, thank you for taking such good care of us.
Did you go to Bastogne as well?
Yes, I did. We saw the lovely Sherman tank they have on the town square.
I haven't been there. I've never
You
been
haven't?
there. No.
Oh, I recommend it. The forest outside of Bastogne where they, all of that crazy stuff from, Band of Brothers you can see in there.
Tell us about the actual song itself. How did this come up?
Actually, a bit different this one. I was sitting very much alone in the old studio and I was writing the music. And I didn't even have any idea what the song was going to be about at this time. To be honest, I might be destroying somebody's illusion of the songwriting process here. But I was so fucking angry and tired with myself because I've been writing a lot on the Coat of Arms album and I just hadn't gotten that punchy, really hard, adrenaline rushing song yet. Probably about 1 or 2 in the morning, I just said, fuck this shit. I'm gonna write a song and I'm not going home until I did. And in that case, that aggression I had towards myself, actually we just kickstarted that intro and which became kind of the chorus as well. Like, making the guitar riff, and it's like, yeah, that's it, let's go, next. Cool. So I just didn't give myself any chance to slow down and overthink it. So it just went like a train from beginning to end. And by 7 or 8 in the morning, it was all done. So it's actually one of the faster Sabaton songs ever written, from a songwriting perspective.
And the neighbors called and said they were really happy?
Yes, they loved it.
Enjoyed the entire songwriting process. They thought, wow.
Can't wait to hear your new album, man.
Keep working at night, man. That's the thing. But hey, something you said before I want to get back to. You mentioned Band of Brothers.
Yes.
I love Band of Brothers.
So do I. It might seem obvious to a lot of people who are into history that, everybody has seen that. But
Well, they might not know that Band of Brothers is about these guys.
Yes. Oh, sorry. It is about the 101st Airborne. And there's a fantastic book called Band of Brothers, written by Stephen Ambrose, if I'm not mistaken as well.
But Band of Brothers itself, the series, you were saying about...
It's almost 20 years old now. And this is something, I guess, if you are under 25 or maybe under 30, you might have missed out on.
You shouldn't miss Band of Brothers. You guys, how awesome is Band of Brothers?
Awesome!
And they're not saying that because they have to, because we could always cut it out and add some screams in there.
Yeah, we got to add some extra screams because they didn't sound enthusiastic enough.
Yeah, we want people to think we have a really big crew as well. Isn't that right, Sergey, George, Geraldo? No, but seriously, Band of Brothers is absolutely amazing. It's if you want to get an idea of not just the fighting part of war, but every aspect of what goes through a soldier's life, you owe it to yourself to check out Band of Brothers.
Yeah, perfect marriage between documentary and Hollywood movie almost. It's a 10 1-hour, TV series.
Yeah, I haven't done. They also did The Pacific, which I have not seen yet. The Pacific.
What?
No, I have not seen.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, the first time around I watched it, I didn't think it was as good as Band of Brothers. But the second time I watched The Pacific, I actually think I liked it even more.
All right, well, that is it for Screaming Eagles.
And that's it for today.
I'm going to hell.
All right, everyone, remember to check us out on Patreon. Check those videos, Time Ghost, and World War II. Don't forget that. And also, see you next time.